The studio lights were brighter than the city outside. Behind the massive windows, Los Angeles glittered beneath the dark evening sky. Cars moved like streams of light through the streets below, while inside the television studio, hundreds of people waited for the next guest. The audience was excited. They had come expecting jokes. They had come expecting laughter. They had come expecting another unforgettable television performance from one of America's most famous comedians. But nobody in that room knew that before the night was over, the laughter would disappear. And nobody knew that the reason would be a quiet man sitting in the middle of the stage. Bruce Lee. He sat calmly in a black traditional Chinese jacket, his hands resting loosely in his lap. His posture was relaxed, almost casual. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He didn't need to. For Bruce, the room was simply another environment. Another place to observe. Another place to learn. But across from him sat a man who had no intention of making the evening easy. Rodney Dangerfield leaned back in his chair, studying Bruce with a mischievous smile. The audience already knew what was coming. Rodney was famous for pushing buttons, and Bruce Lee was about to become his newest target. The host smiled toward the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, our next guest has become one of the most talked about martial artists in the world." The audience applauded. Bruce nodded politely. The host continued. "He's known for his incredible speed, his discipline, and his unique approach to martial arts." More applause. Bruce smiled. Then Rodney suddenly leaned toward his microphone. "Speed." The audience laughed. Rodney looked at Bruce. "That's what we are calling it now." The audience laughed even louder. Bruce simply looked at him. No reaction. Rodney continued. "I've seen bigger muscles on a coat hanger." The audience exploded. Bruce smiled slightly. The host laughed nervously. He knew Rodney was warming up. Rodney pointed at Bruce's arms. "You're telling me this guy is supposed to scare people?" More laughter. Bruce remained still. His eyes didn't move. Rodney leaned closer. "I mean, look at him." He gestured toward Bruce. "Karate won't save you here." The room erupted. People clapped. Some audience members whistled. Rodney leaned back proudly, as if he had just delivered the greatest joke of the evening. But then something changed. Bruce stopped smiling. It was subtle. So subtle that most people didn't notice. But the host did. Bruce's shoulders remained relaxed. His hands remained still. His face remained calm. Only his eyes changed. The host stared at him for a moment. There was no anger there. No hatred. No desire to attack. Something else. Complete concentration. The host suddenly wondered whether Rodney had gone too far. Bruce slowly turned his head toward Rodney. Rodney's smile remained. "Well." Bruce said nothing. The silence lasted only a few seconds. But inside that studio, it felt much longer. Rodney tried to break it. "What?" Bruce finally spoke. "You enjoy making people uncomfortable." Rodney shrugged. "That's my job." A few people laughed. Bruce nodded. "Then you're very good at your job." The audience laughed again. Rodney smiled. He thought Bruce was playing along. He didn't understand what had just happened. Bruce had accepted the joke. But he hadn't accepted the challenge. There was a difference. The host moved the conversation forward. "So Bruce, tell us something. What makes a great fighter?" Bruce leaned slightly forward. A great fighter. Yes. Bruce thought for a moment. Someone who understands himself. Rodney immediately interrupted. Oh, here we go. The audience laughed. Rodney shook his head. I'm trying to understand myself too. He pointed toward Bruce. But I'm still waiting to understand how a man that size is supposed to win a fight. Bruce looked at him. Size helps. Rodney smiled. Finally, something sensible. Bruce continued. But only until it doesn't. The laughter slowly faded. Rodney's expression changed. Bruce wasn't joking. The host leaned forward. What do you mean? Bruce looked toward the audience. People think fighting is about strength. He paused. It's not. The studio became quieter. They think it's about being bigger. Another pause. It's not. Bruce looked at Rodney. They think it's about hurting another person. His voice became softer. It isn't. Rodney stared at him. Bruce continued. Fighting is about control. Those two words seemed to hang in the air. Control. The host nodded slowly. Rodney smiled again. So if someone attacks you, you just control them. Bruce nodded. If necessary. Rodney looked toward the audience. Well, that's convenient. Laughter returned. But this time, Bruce smiled too. The tension broke. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The show continued. The audience asked questions. Bruce demonstrated a few movements with his hands. Rodney made jokes. The host kept the conversation moving. But underneath all of it, something was building. Because Rodney wasn't finished. Not even close. And Bruce knew it. About 4 minutes into this story, I want to ask you something. If you were sitting in that audience and Rodney had just mocked Bruce Lee in front of hundreds of people, what would you expect Bruce to do? Would you want him to ignore it? Would you want him to demonstrate his skills? Or would you want him to accept Rodney's challenge? Write your answer in the comments. And tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, India, or somewhere else? If you're enjoying the story, hit the like button, subscribe, and stay with us. Because Bruce had not shown the audience what he could really do yet. And Rodney was about to make a mistake he would remember for a very long time. The cameras continued rolling. Rodney looked at Bruce again. You know something. Bruce waited. I think you're getting too much credit. The host raised his eyebrows. The audience became quiet. Rodney continued. I think people see you on television kicking boards and punching bags, and they think you're some kind of superhero. Bruce smiled faintly. I'm not. Rodney laughed. At least we agree on something. Bruce nodded. I'm just a man. Rodney leaned forward. Exactly. He pointed at Bruce. And that's the problem. The audience reacted. Rodney stood. The host immediately looked concerned. Rodney. But Rodney ignored him. He walked toward the open space in front of the chairs. Bruce remained seated. Rodney turned toward the audience. Let's settle something. The audience began whispering. Rodney looked back at Bruce. You say fighting is about control. Bruce nodded. Then show us. The room became completely silent. The host stood halfway from his chair. Wait. Rodney smiled. What? This isn't a fight show. Rodney laughed. I'm not asking for a fight. He looked directly at Bruce. "I'm asking for a demonstration." Bruce slowly stood. The audience gasped. The difference between the two men was obvious. Rodney was heavier, broader, older. He looked comfortable. Bruce looked smaller, lighter, almost fragile by comparison. Rodney smiled. "This should be easy." Bruce said nothing. He walked toward the center of the studio. The cameras followed him. The audience leaned forward. Bruce stopped several feet away. He raised his hands. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough. Rodney raised his own hands. The host looked from one man to the other. "This is still television, gentlemen." Bruce nodded. Rodney grinned. "Don't worry." Then Rodney moved. It wasn't a real attack, just a quick attempt to grab Bruce's shoulder. But Bruce disappeared sideways. The audience gasped. Rodney turned. Bruce was already standing behind him. The audience erupted. Rodney laughed. "Lucky." Bruce smiled. "Maybe." Rodney tried again. This time faster. Bruce stepped back. Rodney reached forward. Bruce shifted. Again. And again. Every time Rodney moved, Bruce was somewhere else. Not running. Not jumping. Not fighting. Simply moving. The host stared. The audience had stopped laughing. They were watching. Rodney's smile slowly disappeared. He tried one more time. Bruce caught his wrist. For a fraction of a second, nobody understood what had happened. Bruce hadn't struck him. He hadn't twisted his arm violently. He had simply taken control of Rodney's movement. Rodney looked down at his wrist, then back at Bruce. Bruce released him immediately. No humiliation. No celebration. No punch. Nothing. Just control. The audience burst into applause. Rodney stepped backward. He looked confused. Bruce returned to his chair. The host slowly sat down. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Rodney broke the silence. "You planned that?" Bruce shook his head. "No." Rodney stared at him. "Then how did you know where I was going?" Bruce looked at him calmly. "Because you showed me." Rodney frowned. "I didn't show you anything." Bruce smiled. "You did." The host leaned toward Bruce. "What did he show you?" Bruce looked at Rodney. "His intention." The audience became silent again. Bruce continued. "Before the body moves, the mind moves." The host slowly nodded. Rodney didn't laugh this time. For the first time that night, he looked genuinely interested. Bruce could see the change. The comedian wasn't performing anymore. He was thinking. But then Rodney smiled again. A dangerous little smile. "Okay." Bruce looked at him. Rodney stepped forward. "One more." The host immediately shook his head. "Rodney, I think we've made our point." Rodney didn't listen. He looked at Bruce. "This time." He paused. "I won't tell you what I'm going to do." Bruce stood again. The audience erupted. The host looked worried. The cameras moved closer. Rodney raised his hands. Bruce raised his. The room fell silent. And somewhere behind the cameras, the host whispered something that nobody at home could hear. Because he had seen the look in Bruce Lee's eyes. And this time, Bruce wasn't smiling. The lights seemed brighter. The audience seemed quieter. Rodney took one step forward. Bruce didn't move. Rodney took another. Bruce remained perfectly still. Then Rodney suddenly lunged. And just before the two men met, the cameras cut away. The audience screamed. And nobody knew what had happened until the cameras came back to Bruce Lee, standing calmly in the center of the studio. And Rodney Dangerfield was staring at him in complete silence. For several seconds, nobody in the studio moved. The cameras were rolling again. The audience was silent. Rodney Dangerfield stood several feet away from Bruce Lee, staring at him as if he had just discovered that the man sitting beside him all evening was not the man he thought he was. Bruce remained completely calm. His hands were lowered. His breathing was steady. His black jacket looked exactly as it had before. There was no dramatic pose, no celebration, no smile, nothing that suggested he had just dominated the situation. Rodney slowly looked down at his own hands. Then he looked back at Bruce. "What did you do?" Bruce didn't answer immediately. The host leaned forward. "Bruce." Bruce finally spoke. "I moved." Rodney shook his head. No, you did more than move." A few people in the audience laughed nervously. Rodney pointed at Bruce. "I was coming straight at you." Bruce nodded. "You were." And then Rodney paused. "I was standing over there." Bruce smiled. "You lost your balance." Rodney looked offended. "I did not lose my balance." Bruce tilted his head. "Then what happened?" Rodney opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The audience laughed. This time, Bruce laughed too. The tension finally broke. Rodney shook his head. "Okay, I hate you already." The audience exploded with laughter. Bruce smiled. The host laughed in relief. But behind the laughter, something important had changed. Rodney no longer looked at Bruce as a joke. He looked at him as a martial artist. And that distinction mattered. The host turned toward Bruce. "Can you explain what just happened?" Bruce nodded. "When someone moves toward you, they expect you to react." He paused. "If you react exactly the way they expect, they control you." The host asked, "So what do you do?" Bruce looked toward Rodney. "You don't give them what they expect." Rodney folded his arms. "So basically, you're saying I'm predictable." Bruce smiled. "You are." The audience laughed again. Rodney shook his head. "I walked right into that one." Bruce nodded. "Yes." The laughter became louder. But Rodney wasn't embarrassed anymore. He was fascinated. He stepped closer. "Teach me." The audience reacted immediately. Bruce raised an eyebrow. Rodney continued. "Seriously?" Bruce looked at him for a moment. Then he said something that surprised everyone. "First, stop trying to win." Rodney frowned. "What?" "Stop trying to win every moment." The studio became quiet again. Bruce continued. "When you are trying to prove you're stronger, faster, smarter." He paused. "You stop seeing what is happening." Rodney stared at him. For the first time that evening, there was no joke on his face. The host noticed it too. This was no longer a comedy segment. It had become something deeper. Rodney slowly lowered his arms. "You really believe that?" Bruce nodded. "I've learned it the hard way." The camera moved closer to Bruce. His expression was calm, but there was something emotional beneath his words. Bruce had spent years being underestimated. Because he was smaller. Because he was Asian. Because people looked at his body before they listened to his mind. Because some people saw martial arts as entertainment. They didn't understand the years of discipline behind every movement. They didn't see the early mornings, the endless repetitions, the bruises, the failures, the loneliness. They only saw the result. And Rodney had unknowingly touched a subject Bruce understood very well. Being judged before being understood. The host sensed the shift. Bruce, did you ever get tired of people underestimating you? Bruce looked toward the audience. Yes. The answer was immediate. The room became silent. But it helped me. The host looked surprised. How? Bruce leaned back. When people underestimate you, you learn not to depend on their approval. Those words hit harder than any punch. Rodney slowly nodded. For a moment, even he had nothing funny to say. Then Bruce continued. You stop performing for them. He looked directly into Rodney's eyes. And you start becoming better for yourself. The audience applauded. Rodney looked down. His expression had changed completely. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't mocking Bruce. He was listening. And that was when the host realized something. The night had started with Rodney trying to expose Bruce. Now Bruce was quietly exposing something about Rodney. The comedian had spent years making people laugh before they could laugh at him. Bruce had spent years becoming so disciplined that other people's opinions couldn't move him. Two very different men. But perhaps they understood each other more than either expected. About 4 or 5 minutes have passed, so let me ask you another question. If you were Bruce Lee, would you have stayed calm after being mocked in front of a live audience? Or would you have accepted Rodney's challenge immediately? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to write where you're watching from asterisk. We want to know how far this story has traveled. If you're enjoying it, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us. Because what happened next made Rodney realize that the demonstration he'd just witnessed wasn't even Bruce Lee's most impressive ability. The host leaned forward. Bruce, you said fighting is about control. Bruce nodded. Yes. Control of your opponent. Bruce shook his head. First, control of yourself. The host smiled. Explain that. Bruce looked toward Rodney. If your emotions control you, your opponent doesn't have to. Rodney's eyebrows rose. Bruce continued. Anger makes you predictable. Fear makes you predictable. Pride makes you predictable. He paused. Even excitement can make you predictable. The studio was completely silent. Bruce's words were simple, but they carried weight. Rodney leaned forward. So what are you supposed to feel? Bruce answered quietly. Whatever you feel. Rodney frowned. That doesn't sound like control. Bruce smiled. It is. He explained that control didn't mean becoming emotionless. It meant refusing to let emotion make your decisions. A person could feel anger without acting from anger. A person could feel fear without becoming fear. A person could feel pressure without allowing pressure to decide what happened next. Rodney listened carefully. Then he asked, So when I insulted you? Bruce smiled. You wanted me to become angry. Rodney laughed. Maybe. But I didn't. Rodney nodded. No. Bruce looked at him. You wanted a reaction. Rodney shrugged. That is what comedians do. Bruce smiled. And I gave you one. Rodney looked confused. What reaction? Bruce leaned forward. A lesson. The audience erupted. Rodney laughed loudly. All right. He pointed at Bruce. That's actually pretty good. The host smiled. But then Rodney's expression became serious. You know what? Bruce waited. I wasn't really trying to hurt you. Bruce nodded. I know. Rodney looked surprised. You knew? Yes. How? Bruce pointed gently toward Rodney's face. Your eyes. The audience became quiet. Bruce continued. Your mouth was making jokes. He paused. But your eyes were asking a question. Rodney stared at him. What question? Bruce answered. Can you really do what they say you can do? The studio went silent. Rodney's face changed. Because Bruce was right. Behind all the jokes, there had been curiosity. Rodney had wanted to know whether the man in front of him was genuinely exceptional or simply another celebrity surrounded by exaggerated stories. And now he had his answer. But Rodney wasn't ready to let the night end. He stood again. The host immediately said, No. The audience laughed. Rodney looked at him. I didn't even say anything. You don't have to. More laughter. Rodney turned toward Bruce. One final test. Bruce looked at him. What kind? Rodney glanced around the studio. Something nobody can fake. The host sighed. Rodney. But Bruce nodded. Okay. The audience reacted with excitement. Rodney looked toward the production crew. Bring me something. A crew member hesitated. The host asked what he wanted. Rodney pointed toward the backstage area. A board. A wooden board was brought onto the stage. Rodney held it. The audience immediately understood. Bruce looked at the board. Then at Rodney. Rodney smiled. Break it. Bruce shook his head. No. The audience murmured. Rodney looked surprised. No. Bruce nodded. No. Why? Because breaking a board doesn't prove much. Rodney laughed. So now you won't do it. Bruce smiled. I can. Rodney raised his eyebrows. Then why not? Bruce looked at him. Because you asked the wrong question. The audience went quiet. Rodney waited. Bruce continued. You're asking whether I can break wood. He paused. The better question is whether I can control myself enough to know when I should. The host slowly smiled. Rodney looked at the board. Then at Bruce. For several seconds, he said nothing. Finally, he lowered it. You know. He shook his head. I thought I was going to make you look ridiculous tonight. Bruce smiled. You almost did. Rodney laughed. The audience laughed with him. Then Rodney extended his hand. Bruce looked at it. He shook it. The applause grew louder. But just as everyone thought the tension was over, a voice came from behind the cameras. That's not enough. Everyone turned. A man from the production crew had stepped forward. He was large, broad-shouldered, confident. He had been watching the entire exchange. He looked at Bruce. You've been talking about control all night. Bruce turned toward him. The host immediately became uncomfortable. Rodney looked surprised. The man continued. "Let's see how you handle someone who doesn't play around." The audience fell silent. Bruce studied him. Rodney whispered, "Don't." But Bruce didn't look away. The man stepped onto the stage. The host stood. "This isn't part of the show." The man smiled. "Maybe it should be." Bruce remained completely still. The host looked at Bruce, then at the man. The atmosphere had changed again. This wasn't comedy anymore. This wasn't a friendly demonstration. Something real was about to happen. Bruce slowly raised his hands. The man's smile disappeared. The audience leaned forward. Rodney stood frozen beside the host. And then Bruce looked directly into the camera. For just 1 second, his eyes seemed to meet the audience at home. Calm, focused, unshaken. Then he whispered, "Let's see what he knows." The man stepped forward. Bruce didn't move. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. The man suddenly attacked. And this time, Bruce didn't step away. He stepped forward. The audience gasped. Rodney's eyes widened. And the host finally understood what he had seen in Bruce's eyes earlier. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even confidence. It was something much more dangerous. Bruce Lee was completely present. And whatever happened next, he was ready for it. The man lunged forward. Bruce Lee moved at the same instant. There was no dramatic shout. No wild swing. No wasted motion. The attack came toward Bruce's chest, but Bruce shifted his body just enough to let it pass. The man's momentum carried him forward. Bruce touched his arm, redirected it, and stepped aside. The man nearly lost his balance. The audience gasped. Rodney Dangerfield stared. The man recovered quickly and turned around. His confidence was gone. He attacked again. This time, Bruce moved even faster. A small step. A quick parry. A controlled turn. Suddenly, the man's wrist was trapped. Bruce didn't hurt him. He simply held him in place. The man struggled. Bruce remained completely still. "Relax," Bruce said quietly. The man pulled harder. Bruce released him. The man stepped backward. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Bruce lowered his hands. "That is the difference," he said. The man looked confused. "Difference between what?" "Fighting someone." Bruce paused. "And understanding them." The audience erupted into applause. Rodney slowly walked toward Bruce. He looked at him differently now. Not like a comedian looking for another joke. Like a man who had just witnessed something he couldn't explain. Rodney smiled. "I think I owe you an apology." Bruce nodded. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Rodney looked toward the audience. "I came here tonight thinking this guy was just another celebrity with a lot of stories around him." He looked back at Bruce. "I was wrong." Bruce smiled. The host joined them. "Bruce, I think the audience has learned something tonight." Bruce nodded. "What?" The host smiled. "That the quietest person in the room might be the one you should be paying attention to." The audience laughed and applauded. Bruce looked toward Rodney. Rodney shook his head. "You know what really bothers me?" Bruce waited. "I spent the whole night trying to make you angry." Bruce smiled. "You failed." Rodney laughed. "Exactly." The audience erupted. Then the host asked the question everyone had been waiting for. When you looked at Rodney earlier, what were you thinking? Bruce paused. The studio became quiet. I was thinking. He looked toward Rodney. That he didn't really want to hurt me. Rodney's smile disappeared. Bruce continued. He wanted to know if I was real. Rodney nodded slowly. Bruce looked toward the audience. And now he knows. A huge wave of applause filled the studio. But before the applause faded, the host leaned closer. Bruce, one last question. Bruce nodded. What do you want people to remember about tonight? Bruce looked at the cameras. His expression became serious. Don't judge someone by the size of their body. He paused. Don't judge them by their voice. Another pause. And don't judge them by how loudly they speak. Bruce looked directly into the camera. Watch what they do when nobody is watching. The audience became silent. Then the applause began. Slowly at first. Then louder. Rodney stood beside Bruce and applauded with everyone else. About 4 minutes have passed, so before we continue toward the final moment, tell us what you think. Did Bruce Lee handle Rodney's challenge the right way? Would you have stayed calm, or would you have answered the insult differently? Write your answer in the comments and tell us where you're watching from *. If you're watching from the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, India, or anywhere else in the world, write your country below. And if you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe *. Because there was still one final moment that nobody in the studio expected. The cameras were preparing for the next segment. Rodney sat down. Bruce returned to his chair. The host smiled. Everything seemed finished. But Rodney suddenly leaned toward Bruce. Can I ask you something? Bruce looked at him. Sure. Rodney lowered his voice. Were you ever actually angry with me? Bruce thought for a moment. Then he smiled. No. Rodney looked surprised. Not even once. Bruce shook his head. No. Why? Bruce looked at him. Because anger would have given you control. Rodney stared at him. Then he laughed. You really don't let anything go, do you? Bruce smiled. Not when it's important. Rodney extended his hand again. Bruce shook it. This time there was no joke. No challenge. Just respect. And the audience understood. The man who had entered the studio as the target of a joke had walked out, having earned something much harder to gain. Respect. But outside the studio, something unexpected was already happening. The people watching the broadcast were beginning to talk. Who was this Bruce Lee? How could someone so physically small command a room without raising his voice? Why had Rodney's jokes stopped being funny? And most importantly, what exactly had the host seen in Bruce Lee's eyes? The answer would become the final lesson of the night. And it would come from Bruce himself. The cameras were still rolling. The audience was still applauding. But Bruce Lee had become unusually quiet. Rodney Dangerfield sat beside him, no longer looking for another joke. The host leaned toward Bruce. You said earlier that you don't judge people by what they say, you watch what they do. Bruce nodded. That's right. The host smiled. So what did you see tonight? Bruce looked toward Rodney. A man who wanted to know the truth. Rodney slowly nodded. Bruce continued. He used jokes to ask a serious question. Rodney laughed softly. That sounds about right. The audience laughed with him, but Bruce's expression remained thoughtful. You were asking if the stories were real. Rodney looked at him. Yes. Bruce nodded. Now you know. The host leaned back. And what did you learn? Rodney looked at Bruce for a long moment. That being small doesn't mean being weak. The audience applauded. Rodney continued. And being loud doesn't mean being strong. Bruce smiled. That was the answer Bruce had been waiting for all evening. Not an apology. Not praise. Understanding. The host turned toward the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, I think tonight's conversation has taken a very unexpected direction. The audience laughed. Rodney raised his hand. I blame him. He pointed toward Bruce. Bruce laughed. The tension was finally gone. But then Rodney stood and walked toward the center of the studio. He looked at Bruce. Can I try something? Bruce stood. Rodney raised his hands. The audience laughed. The host immediately said, Please tell me we're not doing this again. Rodney smiled. No fighting. He looked at Bruce. Just one lesson. Bruce nodded. Rodney attempted the movement Bruce had shown him earlier. He shifted his feet, moved his shoulders, tried to redirect his imaginary opponent. It looked awkward. The audience laughed. Rodney tried again. Bruce stepped beside him. Relax your shoulders. Rodney did. Don't look at your hands. Rodney lowered his eyes. Look at the person. Rodney looked up. Bruce continued. Don't fight the movement. He gently adjusted Rodney's position. Use it. Rodney tried again. This time the movement was smoother. The audience applauded. Rodney looked surprised. I actually did it. Bruce smiled. Yes. Rodney looked toward the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I have officially become dangerous. The audience exploded with laughter. Bruce laughed too. The host shook his head. But then he looked at Bruce. You know what I noticed? Bruce waited. You never once tried to embarrass him. Bruce looked toward Rodney. Why would I? The host smiled. Most people would. Bruce shook his head. If I win by humiliating someone, what have I really won? The studio became quiet. Those words landed harder than anything Bruce had demonstrated. Rodney stared at him. Then he slowly nodded. That, he paused, is probably the smartest thing you've said tonight. Bruce smiled. The host looked toward the audience. And perhaps the smartest thing we've heard all week. The applause returned. About 4 minutes have passed, and before we close this story, I want to hear from you. What was Bruce Lee's greatest strength tonight? Was it his speed, his technique, his discipline, or his ability to remain calm while everyone around him was trying to provoke him? Tell us your answer in the comments. And don't forget to write where you're watching from. We'd love to see how many different countries are following Bruce's story tonight. If you've enjoyed this story, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves Bruce Lee and martial arts stories. Because the final moment is the one the host remembered most. The show was almost over. The audience had begun to leave. The cameras were being switched off. Rodney was gathering his things. Bruce stood near the edge of the stage. The host walked toward him. Bruce. Bruce turned. I want to ask you something. Bruce nodded. When I looked at you earlier. The host paused. I thought you were angry. Bruce smiled. I wasn't. I know that now. The host looked toward the emptying studio. But there was something in your eyes. Bruce remained silent. The host continued. It looked like you had already decided what was going to happen. Bruce smiled slightly. No. The host looked surprised. No. Bruce shook his head. I didn't know what was going to happen. He paused. I only knew what I was going to do. The host stared at him. That was the answer. That was the look he had seen. Bruce hadn't known what Rodney would do. He hadn't known what the other man would do. He hadn't known what the audience would think. He hadn't known how the evening would end. But he knew one thing. He would control himself. And that was enough. Rodney walked over. Are you two talking about me again? The host laughed. Actually, yes. Rodney looked at Bruce. What did he say? Bruce smiled. He said he finally understood my eyes. Rodney laughed. Good. He shook Bruce's hand one final time. Then he became serious. I'm glad you came tonight. Bruce nodded. So am I. Rodney looked toward the cameras. You know what? Bruce waited. I think the audience came here expecting a martial arts demonstration. He looked at Bruce. But they got something else. Bruce smiled. What? Rodney answered. A lesson. Bruce nodded. The studio lights began to dim. The audience was nearly gone. The cameras stopped. And for the first time that night, Bruce Lee was no longer performing. He was simply standing there. Quiet. Calm. Human. The jokes had ended. The challenge had ended. The laughter had ended. But the lesson remained. Bruce Lee didn't need to prove that he was the strongest man in the room. He didn't need to prove that he could hurt someone. He didn't need to silence Rodney with a punch. He had done something far more difficult. He had remained himself while everyone else tried to make him become someone else. And perhaps that was the real meaning behind the look in his eyes. Not anger, not fear, not arrogance. Control. The ability to remain calm when the room becomes chaotic. The ability to remain focused when people laugh at you. The ability to walk away from an insult without carrying it with you. And the ability to know that sometimes the strongest response is not a punch. It is restraint. As Bruce walked out of the studio, Rodney watched him disappear behind the curtain. Then he looked at the host. You know something. The host smiled. What? Rodney shook his head. I still think he's too small. The host laughed. Rodney smiled. But... He paused. I wouldn't want to fight him. The host laughed again. The cameras were already off. But somewhere in that dark studio, the words remained. The comedian had entered the night, expecting to make Bruce Lee the joke. Instead, Bruce Lee had quietly shown everyone something they would remember. Strength isn't always the person who hits hardest. Sometimes strength is the person who has every reason to react and chooses not to. And that night, the laughter didn't disappear because Bruce Lee had defeated Rodney Dangerfield. It disappeared because, for a few unforgettable minutes, everyone in that room stopped laughing long enough to listen. And when the lights finally went out, Bruce Lee walked away without needing to prove anything. Because the man who controls himself doesn't need the room to believe in him. He already believes in himself.